Hi guys, I am Nu-Trix the Synth guy, and today we're going to talk about granular synthesis and granular effects. It's been, I don't know, a question I've seen online because granular has been there for a long time, but lately we saw a lot of granular, I would say, apps and plugins and synthesizers, especially on the iOS. It kind of, now is the time. I saw a question wondering what's the differences between the different type of plugins, synthesizers using granular synthesis. So I decided to do a little bit, try to explain what is granular synthesis and give you examples of how it works and how it can be applied to different ways. Because the notion of granular synthesis is, I would say, roughly the same. The application can be really different. For example, we will talk about Ableton Live because Ableton Live uses granular synthesis everywhere in the way it works. We'll talk about the VP-9000, probably the first hardware device to use real-time time stretch with the Roland called Elastic Audio that also uses some type of granular synthesis in it. The iPad apps, FRMS frames, I would say. We'll talk about Granulizer from Bleass, and we'll talk about Spacecraft. They're all different. They all have a different way of working. They all have a different, I would say, target of objective, the way it's going to do things and why it exists and why it uses granular synthesis. So let's start with the basic. Granular, the name comes from the fact that you take a digital audio sound and you create a block out of it. What I mean by that, it will slice in time, like sampling, basically. But it will take a block of time. So the block has a length, has a range of frequencies. So it can be very tall if you want, taking from 20 to 20,000. That's a big block. Or it can be just I don't know, 100 frequencies of the range itself is going to take. The length, well, you understand, it can be long or short. If it's short, it could be as short as one cycle, and it can be long as a minute, or whatever it is, so depending on the software. It's a block of frequencies, basically. So that's the block. Now, the block can be sharp when it starts and when it stops, or it can be slowly going in and slowly going out. So having an attack and a decay, if you want, or a release. So basically, when you have that block with these slope at each side, you have a grain. Basically, that's what it's called, a grain. Now, if you have many grains at the same time, we could say we have some type of a cloud of grains, a lot of grains happening. So these grains will basically take the same sound and play it again and again and again. So it becomes polyphonic. You know, a lot of time you hear the same sound. Now, the software or the hardware you're using could say, well, I want these other grains to be randomly changed in pitch and length and stereo space. So it became very, I would say, mobile and flexible and active. Now, today, the way granular synthesis is used, I would say it's used primarily for three things. One, change the tempo without changing the pitch. Because in the old days of digital audio, if you play slower, it would just play lower and slower. You know, the pitch, let's say a drum, would just be slow and sound big and low. And we'll do an example for that. But with granular synthesis, well, you can make it sound like it's just slow without changing the pitch, or changing the pitch without changing the speed. So you separate these two, which was not possible before applying granular synthesis to digital audio. You can also do that with pitch for somebody who sings. So some type of vocoding control. Vocoder is not that, but you could do some type of pitch control. Autotune could be done with granular synthesis because you could isolate the pitch from the length and the way the person sings. You can also say, well, I want to change the formant, the way the throat will be, so it sounds like a more feminine voice or a masculine voice. So you would be able to control these things because the software or the algorithm controlling the clouds of grains would be able to say, oh, you want this, I'm going to change the grains this way. So in these applications, you would not control the grain one by one. You would actually ask the software or the hardware to do this job, slow down the speed, or I want to play this key, I want a note to sing that note. So, and the algorithm would control the grain the way you want, you know, and you wouldn't see that. It would be kind of, you know, hidden away under the hood. The other approach is basically to create new sounds. It's in the synthesis or in the plugin area. A synthesis, well, basically you're going to load a sound, you're going to control the grain and create something else out of it. Very efficient for weird or spacey sounds and vaporous type of ambience sound, droning. So it would be great for that. If you're in the synthesis, sound design with granular synthesis would be really efficient for that. So let's start. I'm going to give you an example, first of all, with the VP-9000, the first piece of gear that was released that did what Roland called elastic audio. It was in 2000. And I remember that when this came out, I saw the conference of the product specialist and the engineer behind the design of that device. Most people did not understand what it was. People thought it was just a sampler. And what I mean just a sampler is that it had, at the time, a lot less notes of polyphony than other samplers, and it had a lot less a sampling memory than other samplers. But the logic is that if you take, you know, in the traditional sampling world, if you want to do a piano sound, or you want to do a choir singing, you would need to record many notes and many velocities, and then it would take a lot of RAM in memory of your sampler to play all of these sounds so it sounds natural. In the case of the VP-9000, it would actually sample one sound, and then it'd say, well, with granular synthesis or with our magical analysis of the sound, we can change the pitch, we can change the length, we can play many of that, and it sounds natural. It's not perfect like any piece of gear and hardware, but I personally love that piece of gear. So I'll explain. I'm going to show you, I'm going to, with a closer camera. So when you sample it, you have a choice. After it's sampled, you can then edit the waveform. You can, you know, change the tempo. That would be kind of the traditional way of cutting, modifying, selecting region. And then you've got the encoding. And that's where the magic happens. When you encode, you have to select where you're going to see these little arrow you see here is where the attack of the sounds. So it knows that this is a rhythm sound. And then you have a choice of backing. You have backing, ensemble, and solo. I'm going to show you another one. If you go sample, there's drum here, I've got bass, I've got choir, and see, this is using backing. Backing is an instrument that is polyphonic and that has a lot of, you know, attack. So it's just kind of, in this case, you have piano is with a lot of attack. Choir is using ensemble. Ensemble is polyphonic instruments. In this case, I've got choir. So what's cool is after you go through this type of analysis, it will give you different controls. You see you've got these controls here. So if I go preview, I can change the pitch. That's my loop coming back. And I also have the time. Now it's on like one cycle, looping. That's fast. And I've got this formant, which is this one is a groove, but it's not obvious for this. Let's try another one. Let's go to the drum. Okay, change the pitch. And the time. And then you loop one cycle. Let's go back to this. And you have also groove. You could use it to change a little bit of the groove. In this case, you also have to program it. And the last one I want you to listen to is the voice. In this case, I sample my voice.
This is the next thing.
Oh, this
Are
is...
you ready for it?
This is so good. So you can actually
This
go...
is the next thing.
Go down.
Are you ready for
or
it?
higher.
This is the next
Change the
thing.
time. I think even cycle just one. And again, I have control over that without any problem.
Are you ready for it? This is the next thing. Are you ready for it?
This is
And
the
this
next thing.
deformant.
Are you ready for it?
This is the next thing.
So you really have separate control over parts of a sound that you did not use. Remember that this is 20 years old. This was in 2000. Now, there's a cool thing. There's a switch here called Robot. You take it off, and then the original sound does not have a pitch anymore. It just goes...
This is the next thing. Are you ready for it? This is the next thing. Are you ready for it?
So you can...
This is the next thing. Are you ready for it? This is...
And then there's a complex way. I mean, you can hook up your keyboard at the back and actually use this and play in real time from the keys, and then your pitch would actually play with that. So it's really powerful. There's a lot of different options here. I'll do another video about this. Actually, Daft Punk uses that in some of their songs for even the lyrics. 20 years ago was already dedicated devices made to do that. You know, I mean, this is kind of normal today, especially if we talk about Ableton Live. So let's actually switch to Ableton Live now. In Ableton Live, it's not obvious that you're doing granular synthesis, but it's the engine running behind everything here. So if we take a drum loop like this one here, you get your drum loop playing. Now, if you change the tempo, I'm going to bring that window a little closer here. If you change the tempo here, you know, 90. You slow down the speed. 80. The pitch also changes. 120. So the pitch changes like it would in a sample. Not exactly the same, but so the pitch goes with it. Because if you look at here, at the sample information at the bottom here, it sets 102 BPM. That's the original. And then you get repitch. So it's going to change the pitch as it changes. So here are the ways, same logic, let me stop this. Same logic as we had in the VP-9000 where you would change the algorithm if you want. Same thing here. The way it's going to analyze the information and modify it, the warping if you want, is here. So you've got beats. Oh, you want this to be a drum beat. Okay, so now it's going to change. If I go 80, 90, 80, 50. Now it doesn't change the pitch because now it's not in repitch. So we're doing just slow down, and we have the marker for the tempo like we had in this one, and we have the stretching of the sample because it's looping that sample that we hear. If you go 20, you hear the grain being played. Okay? That's where it is. And again, if you choose something else, like tone and texture, it will work, but it will not do what you want for drums because it will change in a different way. So let's try another sound, because that's where, let's say we say, here we have a cello. It's in beats. Well, if you change that to tones, if we change the tempo, the original is 80. So 80, that's the original. And you got to control the size of the grain. Here you have it. You see? More grains. And can we change the pitch here? Here the grain size. Smaller grains, bigger grains. And you hear the sound. Because when tone, if you go texture, you have the grain size, and you get the flux. So basically, kind of the density of the, or the speed. Smaller grain. Now you hear between the grains. And repitch, well, it's going to change the pitch as you go up and down. You get complex, and you get complex pro, where then you have the formant. Now that's for the voice. So same logic as we saw over there, but implemented in a way that it's very subtle. So every time you move between these different samples and you want to change the way it's going to react, that part is really important in Ableton Live. Choir. Now if we change that to tone, you hear the grain. That's a cool little sound there. Texture. So that's not enough. So this is really cool. So, I mean, again, this is how you can play. If you understand how it works, there's like hidden features within Ableton Live because of that. Onto the iPad. In the iPad, we're going to use frames, FRMS. And that's going to be the first one. This one is a synthesizer, which uses granular synthesis. So it will take a sample, either the one that they provide or yours that you load in. In this case, I loaded the same choir sounds. We have the choir sound. So the way this works, you have different things in it. You have, of course, the sample you load in, and then what you have is a bunch of grains. That's that section where you have a control over the density. Let's put these random stuff out of the random, okay? And put these. So we have the sample. We have the size that we want to play, and we have the grains that we hear. Let's put this to the beginning. So the size basically is going to play the whole thing. Listen, it's very subtle. If you put density, you're going to have more grains playing. Every keys I play trigger other grains. And they work in the forward fashion. They play in one side, on one destination. If we ping-pong them, they're going to go and ping-pong between the beginning and the end of the size of the section. So if you select this section here, or that size here, it's going to play between these two. And you hear that loop. You can have beginning to end, so just gonna play them once and gonna stop. Okay? And the density is how many of them. Let's try just the other one, which is, in this case, it's a piano. So a loop, it becomes kind of a loop. But then again, same logic. If you bring the size very close, it becomes something else. And the more you have density, and on the loop you want to spread, you want stereo spread. It's just becomes something else. So that's a synthesizer in this case. And just for fun, the last one is the drum. It's just bizarre, but I looped backward like a ping pong loop. And again, if you play with it, so it can become something else. It can be a rhythm you use, Or if you want it to be smaller again, it all depends on what you want to do. So it's a totally different way of approaching the same thing we just saw, because now you're in the grain using them to create something different. Whereas the other one, the grain will be controlled by the algorithm that you pick, the way it analyzes the sound and then applies it for you to have the result you want, stretch or pitch or whatever. So it's a different approach. This is for sound design, and the other two options we talked earlier, it's more about controlling it the right way. So let's try another one. So now we're going to go with Spacecraft, which is another, I'm not going to say it's not a synthesizer, it's not a effect processor. I would say it's a sound design tool that can repackage granular stuff. Basically, you can put a sample in it, and you can, using granular synthesis or granular technology, modify it. So we have this here. We have this little screen where you can actually move your sample, and you get two different samples. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to load my own stuff. So I'm going to hear the piano. Piano will go into the load, and the first one, the choir, will go into this one. Okay, so let's listen just to one. Let's go with the piano first. The bottom one is the piano. You can easily see the piano notes. You control volume and position here. You control reverb presence, reverb or not. And it's a filter at the same time, left to right. You can kind of granulize it. You get the grain going a bit weird. Let's say we keep it clean. And then we have this here, which is really fun. You can decide the length of the part that's going to be used. Longer, and from top to bottom, it's how many times this is going to play. And this is, do you want it to be very, let's say, apply a same place, or you want it to be moving? And then you've got this little arpeggiator thing that is really cool. And when you go from top to bottom, you're changing the speed of this arpeggiator. And from left to right, you have it a wider range. And again, if you bring a lot of reverb, it becomes this drone of sound right away. Okay, let's bring that one down and listen to, that's the choir. Choir we had earlier. So if we, like this, it's gonna basically run around the line I decided to put here. If you go like that, it's gonna move around. See the movement in the graphic, and then you can decide it's going to be longer or shorter. Let's have less reverb so we hear it, and then we can say, well, then you play with it until you find it, to be the right thing. And again, if you put some reverb in it, and you want it to be very long, it becomes a very vast space of sound. So this is more a sound design tool to create these evolving texture, if you want, and it's less of an the goal is not as obvious as in let's say Ableton or the VP-9000, where you basically just want a time stretch. And this is it becomes something else. You design new sounds with this. So that's for Spacecraft Granulizer from Bleass. So now this one has a different twist because it's an effect processor. So it's meant to treat in real time whatever comes in. It could be a guitar, a bass, a voice, a drum. Because of that, it can become really bizarre. It can be chaotic. If you go too far with the density of the, basically the density of the grain and randomizing, because there's a lot of random options in here, it becomes just not a noisy thing, but it can really easily become noisy. And if you bring the density very little, it can become a very interesting chopping, time-based effect. Especially if you use the beat section. So we get the piano, okay. Bring the effect in. Now this is in freestyle right now. It's in free sync. So the size is in milliseconds, density is in percentage. And the panning is randomized with this 80% randomized. The shape now is very cut, so the attack and decay of the grain is very steep. You go like this. Now it's softer, and then you can have a percentage of having them changing. Let's say we don't want them all the same, and the warmth is basically you kind of saturate the sound a little bit. So the size is the length of the grain. So you actually, it's sampling in real time the sound and having a longer grain. Now if you select beat, now it becomes interesting because you can say, well, the grain can be, the size of the grain is one thing, the density of the grain is another thing, and the offset is something else. So if you want to say, I can have my original sound, which is this, half percent, so a mix of half and half. And I've got my effect. If I put it exactly at the same speed, I'll load the choir. It's so much efficient in this. So the very static, well, a couple of the notes playing, bring that up. This is really cool. It gives you that chopping effect, because now you see the density is a 16th of a note, so it will trigger a new one every 16th of a note, and the length will be a 16th of a note. So it's just like chopping. If you want it to be longer, so you're triggering every 16th of a note a new grain, but the length is an 1/8 of a note, so longer. So they overlap now. Want to get more? They're just overlapping, so it becomes louder and louder. So if you have a shorter size than the density, you basically have you're triggering short sequence, short grain of sounds. So you create really cool rhythm effects. If you have the original, and again, you can play with the offset. But this is fun. I like this, especially for that kind of randomized chopping effect, which is really cool to give movement. And then if you put it backward, -100, it plays backward. So it's very different in the way all of these work. They all have a different twist and different approach. And keep in mind that granular synthesis or granular audio, if you want, has different ways to work. The grain itself is just one way to break down the signal and then be able to control that. And in a lot of softwares, basically it happens under the hood, and you basically just have a control saying, well, I want to change the tempo. And it does the job for you. When you're more into sound designing, then you have more control over the actual grain, the amount of them, the length, and the choice of that. So I hope this is actually useful. You got to know more about how granular audio works, and don't compare stuff just, oh, it's granular, it sounds like this. Well, no, it's granular, it's using a different way to do it, like doing virtual analog. Well, they don't sound the same and they don't have the same features, but it's a technology that opens up a box that is unique when you talk about digital audio using granular audio. That's it, guys. I hope you learned a little bit more today and this is useful for you. Like every time I tell you, stay safe and make more music. We'll see you next time. Cheers.